Okay,
so,
Professor.
Good morning. I welcome you all, also on behalf of our director, Alessandro Lanza, to our seminar on the critical assessment of all the approved national hydrogen strategies. This is the first webinar of the newly established FEM research program, which I direct, on the technologies for energy transition. As you all know, a successful transition will only happen if new low carbon technologies become cost effective, allowing us to phase out fossil fuels. In the adoption and penetration of new technologies, social, economic, and regulatory aspects play as important as a role as that of technology R&D. And this new established program focuses precisely on the economic, social, and regulatory conditions that will enable these new technologies to succeed. Currently, the program is divided into 3 projects. The first one is on hydrogen, and in particular on how countries are shaping policies and support for the successful deployment of hydrogen in their energy mix. And this webinar, as I said, is focused on the results of the first stream of this project, where we will be providing a critical assessment of the hydrogen strategies. And we will also give you a first hint of the second stream of the project, which is devoted on the recovery plans and the role that hydrogen plays in the recovery plans. So the second project that is part of our program is on the simulation of net zero and sector coupling. And we are, as a team, we are in the process of developing a comprehensive simulation of the gas and power system to study how the energy systems will evolve and how their design, in particular market design, should be changed or modified in order to accommodate more low carbon technologies. The third and final project that we are currently working on is developing a new cost-benefit analysis tool that can better include risk and uncertainties, and the name of the program is the stochastic cost-benefit analysis. The envisaged output of this third project is to elaborate a support tool for public decision makers that will have to decide how to allocate and where money for the energy transition. In any case, without further ado, I leave the stage first to Filippo Del Grosso, as I said, that will be presenting the analysis on the hydrogen strategies, then to Eduardo, which will provide the first glimpse of hydrogen projects within recovery plans. I invite you to write questions in the chat, because at the end of these 2 presentations, we will have a Q&A session, which will be moderated by our brilliant Ilaria. Let me just remind you that the research report that is the final product of this first stream of work will be available on the FEM website next week. And of course, this webinar is recorded, and therefore the webinar will be available on our YouTube channel. Having said that, Filippo, the stage is all yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Federico. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. A critical assessment of national hydrogen strategies. So this is the first report that we deliver within the Technology of the Energy Transition Group. It is done by me, Edoardo Somenzi, Federico Pontoni. We thank also Giulia Vaglietti from the Lorraine University for her assistance in assessing the data. A very quick agenda for today's presentation. A crystal ball, in a sense, a glimpse of the future, given the current situation with energy and commodity pricing. A quick introduction. Our methodology, the way we built our data set, and our preliminary findings, And then we will follow the structure that we presented in the report, which is divided into 3 different stages. We provided a macroeconomic analysis of the countries delivering hydrogen strategies. We dig into the policy analysis, and again, we went back to the country analysis by providing some aggregated indicators that we called the coherence index and the interest score. Eventually, we will derive our conclusions. Everyone is pretty much aware of what's happening right now in energy and commodity markets. This is a chart taken from a recent article published by Federico Pontoni on the Staffetta Quotidiana, and we see the time series of several indicators. Here we in specific we reported the prezzo unico nazionale, which is the Italian electricity spot price, and the punto di scambio virtuale, which is the Italian gas price, as well as the Dutch benchmark, the TTF. We see that the prices have been recently increased, mainly due to a supply crunch and an increased demand thanks to the recovery from the COVID pandemic. And we see also in the forward market, in the future market, that there are signs of backwardation. So we asked ourselves, ideally, in the future, if we had a crystal ball that would allow us to see colors, and we know that hydrogen is a very colorful topic because of all the different categories of hydrogen that have been described in recent years, what would happen if we had these same energy and commodity prices applied to the hydrogen reality? So we can divide it into threats and opportunity. So we might have an increased complexity of sector coupling option, which means the integration of the power, gas, and heat networks, paired with other issues related to, for instance, the power markets, such as capacity payments, capacity mechanism, the balancing markets, the ancillary services markets, all will become very complex. But at the same time, given that there will be so much margin, there will be also some further opportunities. Brown hydrogen, of course, it is very emission intensive, about 20 tons of CO2 per tons of hydrogen produced. It will be not sustainable. Blue hydrogen, which is the one taken from methane still reforming plus carbon capture, use and storage, which is currently 71% of the current world production, would probably not be economically feasible. And we understand that according to many strategies, blue hydrogen would be a key enabler. So an intermediate step between brown hydrogen and the future green hydrogen. We have also a yellow hydrogen, which is grid-fed via the current energy mix, plus and obtained by electrolysis that will be under cost constraints. With big relevant prices, we will have surely great opportunity in terms of green hydrogen, which is currently a bit out of the market. The technology, the electrolysis technologies is currently under development for some of the solutions. It will probably be more competitive because renewables will not increase, and there is another the stone gas, which is pink hydrogen, which is technically taken from nuclear electricity plus electrolysis. This is very interesting because not even France, which has a quite relevant nuclear capacity, didn't even mention it in their strategies. But with new technology developments in terms of small reactors, in terms of, and we see that in the long run, nuclear fusion, it might even become cost competitive, it might become a reality. This is a critical assessment of national hydrogen strategy, which doesn't mean that we do not think that strategies are important. We believe that they are a fundamental tool, and it is important to stress, to point attention, because hydrogen is relevant in terms of the future energy transition. We do not know yet whether hydrogen will steer the energy transition or will just be complementary. This is still up to debate. However, in this critical assessment, we highlighted some common feature of all those documents. So there is no holistic thinking. So we do not assess a future energy system as overall in terms of their integration, what is generally called the sector coupling option. It is not mentioned. Sector coupling is barely mentioned in many of those hydrogen strategies. There is limited coordination. So every country perceives the hydrogen deployment as a matter of state, which means that every country will state, oh, I'll do this and I'll do that, without no coordination. This doesn't apply, for instance, for other markets. For the gas market, for the electricity market, where we have cross-border trade, we have agreements, we have shared regulatory framework. This doesn't happen. It's not there yet in the hydrogen industry. There are no clear defined targets and objectives, in the sense that some strategies might state we want to abate a tot percentage of CO2. Some other strategies might say we want to deliver, for instance, 50 megaton of hydrogen by 2030. But again, also there is a complex alignment of timing and deadlines, because some strategies focus towards 2030, which is mid-long term. Some strategies focus towards 2050. There are some strategies that put a line in the middle to be around 2040. So it's difficult to find an alignment. And overall, we would like to state the purpose of this report, this work, is to collect the national strategies, which are already quite a few. We try to cluster the data, and we will see this was quite difficult. And we try to provide some qualitative insight. This work is qualitative because of the lack of homogeneity of data. So it was difficult to run some more quantitative econometric assessment. And we try to derive some cross-country macro trends. Sorry. Okay. How did we do? Digging into our methodology, we had to build a data set. We started with some guide documentation. Luckily, there are plenty of reports focusing on the hydrogen industry. We skipped academic papers. We decided just to focus on the industry ones. We collected data from public sources. Here we mentioned Factiva and governmental website. We used a reference manager software, which is called the Mendeley, that is already providing a tag-based classification. But we further implemented it with a more detailed tag system. So here we mentioned some of the elements: author typology, word region. We consider, as I mentioned before, the time spent considered and the kickoff date of the strategy. Those are quite relevant, and we will see in another slide why. And eventually, we collected 26 observations, and all these observations are from governmental sources. And pretty much this is the colorful map that currently we have, and it is still counting. So of course, the report is complete, but the more we wait, the more we get some additional strategies. And the next one will probably be the one of Italy, which is due to be published in November. We see which are the countries that are currently publishing hydrogen strategies, and we see that there is a missing duo, which are the United States and China. About China, I would like to stress that hydrogen is considered important, is mentioned in the 14th 5-year program, that was a 5-year plan, sorry, that was published this year. But according to our methodology, according to our assessment, it's the current document providing details on the Chinese strategy is not considered from governmental issue. Some other reports consider that China has already a strategy in place. We don't think so. The United States are currently missing, which is not true for other federal entities such as Canada, that provided the development strategy of the overall country, as well as Ontario and Alberta, or Australia. United States are likely to move at a single state level. So countries such as states such as California, Florida, so on and so forth. But we shall see in the next months. This is the timeline. ideally speaking, we wanted to stress the fact that there is a line in the middle, which is the COVID outbreak. That was a relevant game changer to us, in a sense that the COVID outbreak, the pandemic, paved the way to the resilience and recovery national plans, which will be the topic of Eduardo's presentation. And those plans, those recovery plans, are relevant to the hydrogen sector in the sense that they actually committed funds, they committed real actual money, which is somehow lacking in the strategy documents. Of course, the COVID outbreak, we put here the line, it was let's say at the end of February 2020, and we see immediately afterwards a big stream of strategies being published that, however, were being prepared before. So there is like an advantage of a country such as Italy that actually had the resilience and recovery plan before the actual definition of the finalized version of the hydrogen strategy. There is a higher degree of commitment. This is some of our key findings. The strategy presented here for Italy is a draft one. Some preliminary finding, as we said just now, there are some draft strategy, about 19%. Italy, New Zealand, some states within Australia, mainly. Strategies are, of course, at the national level. We consider also the regional dimension for federated entities. On average, the objectives are set at 2030. And as I was mentioning before, there is a long-term commitment to 2050, but again, there is no alignment. So some strategy actually mention long-term commitment up to 2040. Again, with preliminary findings, we believe that every strategy has a focus. This is what we call the strategy focus, which is a kind of either explicit or implicit declaration of what is the direction that each country is currently pursuing. So we assess that there is a limited attention on uses. Focus is more on what we call the sectorial focus, which means that a strategy is actually assessing the whole supply chain and not focusing on a specific segment, such as production or uses. There is much focus, 58% of the strategy, on export options. There are countries such as France or Spain in Europe that have explicitly declared that they want to export hydrogen. Namely, this hydrogen, as we also see in what we call the green strategy, about 50%, this hydrogen will be green hydrogen, so taken from renewables plus an electrolysis process, which means that most likely many countries are trying to skip the intermediate step of blue hydrogen, which might represent a technical issue. We went through the macroeconomic analysis, so we try to assess what are the countries that are in our data set. So we try to assess what are the per capita emissions by sector. So what is the current energy structure? What is the current consumption structure? And all those data will be available and are provided in our annex to the report. So we see that essentially current emissions are generated by the energy generation sector, by the transport sector, and by the manufacturing and construction sector that include the hard to abate segment, which are a relevant which is a relevant category when we assess hydrogen options. Again, we see that countries presenting national strategies have been on a trajectory of decoupling GDP growth and CO2 emission, which means that they are economically and technologically advanced. Notwithstanding this, they have an higher than average energy intensity. And we see essentially that every big country, at least this is true at European level, and we include Russia, Germany, France, UK, Italy, and Spain, the big energy consumption countries, essentially, the big economies, they have all been thinking about deploying hydrogen strategies. This is, as we see, it is not completely true for countries such as the United States or China. Then the second section is the policy analysis. So we divided our policies into categories and types. Categories are referred to production, export, use, and then we divide the residual category, which we call sectorial, which pertains to the overall value chain of hydrogen. That is important because many policies are generic. So it was very difficult for us to classify whether a policy was relevant to production, export, or use. By the way, those policies are written and those policies are reported in the documents. And then we categorize the types of policies. So ideally, we had financial and targets, financial policies and targets that pertain respectively to the allocation of funds, so the money that is actually allocated to hydrogen solutions, and the definition of quantitative targets. As I recall before, there might be, they are extremely varied. So it might be CO2 emission abatements or tons of hydrogen produced. Those are quantitative policies, and we model them as dummy variables. Ideally speaking, if we have had more homogeneity, we could have actually done some more econometric modeling, but that was not feasible because all those quantitative policies are very different. So they are difficult to align. But we devised also a general policy type, which is a categorical variable. This is more descriptive and qualitative, and we see them here. Those are examples. So under the general policy framework, we have R&D activities, demand side policies, and supply side policies. Those are, for instance, relevant. We have seen them in the rollout, for instance, of electric vehicles. And it is envisaged that also in the hydrogen sector, there will be something going on in a similar fashion. International cooperation, education skills development, technical standards, so on and so forth. And we charted them here. This is essentially a very preliminary chart presenting the general policy at the sectorial level. So what we see is that R&D and education and skills are important because there is a gap of knowledge in the current hydrogen industry. So countries are trying to fill this gap and try to improve all the technology and even the education in terms of let's say training of people, of operators that will be engaging in the hydrogen industry. International cooperation and internal regulatory frameworks, those are important for both the trade, the cross-border trade, and the deployment of internal market, and hydrogen logistics, which is mainly mentioned in infrastructure and international cooperation. If we dig further into the general policies, we see that, and this is actually interesting, we see that when we move from the sectorial, which is the whole supply chain, to some more specific types of policy, we have production and export here in those two charts, we see actually that there are way less mentions. So the focus is more on the whole supply chain, but we believe this is also due because of a lack of clarity. We don't really have a clear view of in the long run on how to tackle the issues of production and export respectively. But again, when we see production, R&D still predominant, supply side policies, of course, because we're speaking about the future producers. Export policy are concentrating in few strategies. So we have Canada, Australia, and Chile that provided a very detailed list of what they are going to do. But other countries, notwithstanding the fact that they declare themselves as potential green hydrogen exporters, they didn't provide a detailed list of what they are going to do. This is a lack of clarity in our view. The uses are extremely detailed, so there is much granularity, and that is quite interesting. In a sense, it is counterintuitive because we saw before that the general focus of hydrogen strategy is not on use; it is rather on production. But when we count, when we actually double check how many times uses are mentioned, and then it is referred to transport, hard-to-abate sector, ammonia, energy generation, and building, we see actually that there is much detail on that in terms of, let's say, wishful future engagement, wishful future policies without specific definition, without specific commitments in terms of time, in terms of fund allocated, but the granularity is there. So actually those strategies dig well into the detail. Which kind of detail? Of course, the transport sector. Transport sector is relevant because it is already mature. So we have the fuel cell technology for vehicles, and many strategies are already considering the deployment of buses, of trains moved via the fuel cell technology. It is relevant for the residential sector because it is mentioned the potential blending of blue hydrogen into the grid. It might be 10%, might be 20%, but also, and this is the case for many Asian countries, they are considering the option of heating their houses via the fuel cell technology. What is missing here is the hard-to-abate, which means steel manufacturing, cement, glass production, those kind of industry where it is actually difficult to modify the existing legacy technology, are more assessed by general policy. In a sense, we noted that the higher the degree of uncertainty, the more the topic is tackled by general policies and the less commitment we have. So we don't have specific targets and we don't have financial policies. So we don't have the definition of the way we are gonna allocate our money. The third phase of this report was the assessment at the country level, with the creation of two different indexes, two different indicators. The first one is called the Internal Coherence Index, which provides an assessment of the objective of the strategies in terms of the measures in their support. So we listed 6 transversal objectives that you can find here: willingness to export, hydrogen vehicle deployment, blending of hydrogen, production objective, consumption objective, synfuel and ammonia. We try to understand a criteria to assess those transversal objectives. So whether they are actually mentioned. If those objectives are not mentioned, the score will be 0. Whether there are present some numerical targets, whether there are provision for the allocation of funds, whether there are some other policies. And then we assign the score between 0 and 4 on a scale of a qualitative description, so low, medium, high level, or even absence. We we calculated an overall average, and the results are pretty much here. Essentially, this is a very qualitative assessment, and of course, it's very subjective, depending on the way you run we run the analysis. But what we saw is that it is very difficult to find some defined clusters in terms of the internal coherence index. We try to assess year of publication, we try to assess the economic development, we try to assess geography or the maturity in terms of liberalization, rollout of the overall energy system. And we didn't see that. It's very difficult to aggregate and to find separate clusters. We just see that only 2 strategies feature a high level of internal coherence, which are Poland and United Kingdom, and 3 strategies, Czech Republic, Australia, and Germany, presented a lower level of internal coherence. And pretty much all other strategies are somehow in the middle. The second indicator is the interest score. Again, here we try to find some common ground. So what we did is we assessed the number of general policies, the number of numerical targets, and the number of financial policies that are reported in those hydrogen strategies against the categories of policy that we mentioned before. So sectorial, the one related to the whole supply chain, production, export, and use. Here we provided this web chart. We were again expecting some greater level of alignment, in a sense that we see that each country is devising its own hydrogen strategy in a different way. So some countries are extremely rich in terms of detail, Japan, France, Spain, and Portugal, because they mention a lot of policies, notwithstanding the fact that they might be less or more coherent according to the previous indicator. Some other countries, such as Russia, Italy, Chile, and Czech Republic, present a lower score. But we see, as a rule of thumb, but this is also something that I mentioned before, that there is a general imbalance across categories. So there is much focus on the use, a bit less so on production and export, notwithstanding the fact that those strategies declare that each specific country will be or will not be a green hydrogen exporting country. And quickly, we go to the conclusions. Here we quoted Shakespeare, Much Ado About Nothing. This is one of his most beloved comedies. And it's like many Shakespearean comedies, it's about a love affair. And the fact hydrogen is a love affair because it has been going up and down across the year. We believe this time might be the right one, but we have been speaking about hydrogen for many decades, and much of the technologies, well, some of the technologies, such as fuel cell, are already quite mature. But again, this might be the time, thanks also to the hydrogen strategies, to the recovery, thanks also to the recovery and resilience plans. This might be the right timing for a proper rollout of hydrogen technology and integration within the wider energy system. Again, here we resume all the criticalities. Lack of mention on sector coupling and grid integration. Those are only marginally assessed. Blue hydrogen, the key enabler, the potential key enabler, is mainly missing because the focus is on green strategy. So we need to consider, are countries willing to skip the blue hydrogen step? Then again, as we mentioned, the misalignments, production and use, and the production versus export. Those are not well balanced. we believe that there is a further space for improvement. Then the focus is on subsectors that are easier and immediate to decarbonize, which means that strategies mention the blending and the fuel celling vehicles, but on the other end, they cannot because they don't have a clear view of that. They don't have a completely shaped idea on how to tackle the sector of shipping, albeit, or the wider section of energy generation. So we don't have details on how strategies are going to tackle that. And last is the lack of financial policies and lack of definition in terms of target. We believe that there is a general concern in terms of committing funds. Again, and this is I leave the floor to Eduardo. This was partially tackled by the recovery and resilience plans. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Filippo. So I'm Edoardo Somenzi. I'm part of the group of technologies for energy transition here at the Enrico Mattei Foundation, and I'm here to talk about a sort of analysis. Okay, now you can see me. You should see me. Thank you. Sort of ancillary analysis of the one presented by Filippo Del Grosso, and I will specifically deal with the role of hydrogen and in the recovery and resilience plans, introducing some comparative results between countries that have already presented an hydrogen strategies and those that did not, always remaining within the framework of recovery and resilience. So under the European framework called Next Generation EU, we can find several financed projects. Among them is the Recovery and Resilience Facility, through which basically European members can be financially supported by submitting the known recovery and resilience plans. And the aim is, of course, to launch a process of recovery and innovation following the crisis dictated by the global pandemic. Interestingly, for this analysis is that among the headings, so the flagships areas for investments and reforms that are listed here, hydrogen finds some room, for example, in power, or renovate, or recharge and refuel. So these headings are those in which hydrogen is mentioned and can play a role in the post-pandemic recovery. Now, very briefly, just to recap, this is the process of revision and acceptance of the recovery plans submitted by the member countries. And as far as this analysis is concerned, the staff working documents that you can see here and the annexes, of course, have been used as basis for this work for two main reasons. They are homogeneous, so in terms in terms of data display, and therefore can be compared with respect to the original documents. And they are the final documents published by the Council once the original version of the single member state is accepted. And it is not uncommon that some drafts of the recovery plans are different from the associated staff working document. So we decided to use the staff working document. It is also important to mention that among the pillars on which this framework is based, recovery plans must necessarily devote at least, as you can see, 37% of the funds that are granted to measures that sustain the energy transition, basically, and are tagged as green. The scope of this analysis is simple, but at the same time interesting, since it aims at investigating the commitment, often quoted lately, of the European member states to deploy concrete action in support of hydrogen. It is a completely new point of view with respect to the analysis of the hydrogen strategies, due to the fact that while for the strategies there were no expenditure obligation, basically in this case there is an expenditure obligation and a discrete large availability of funds provided by the European Union. So the work has started with the collection of the staff working document, the clustering of the measures related to hydrogen, and then we moved on with the results, focusing basically on targets and the amount of funds allocated. The data set that has been created is characterized by categorical and quantitative variables. So the former is used mainly to contextualize, and the latter is used as a starting point for a numerical analysis, and also a comparative analysis. And the documents collected and examined are 22. However, it is a constantly updating data set, and as they are published on the European website, we are constantly updating and adding new documents to the data set. It is an ongoing work also for us, and we will publish the report when all the recovery plans will be published and accepted. So now I would like to introduce and start with some results. These are two, this one and the next one are two introductory graphs. This one shows the composition of the packages of resources granted to member states. In the early phase of the process that we have just seen, governments can request different sets of resources. There are the loans and the grants, which are non-repayable funds. We immediately can notice a clustering of the nations that have also presented the hydrogen strategy marked with a green rectangle that you can see here below the bars. I'd like to stress the fact that the absolute impact on hydrogen not only varies due to these percentages that you can see here, but of course also on the overall amount of funds devoted to each country. An example, a quite clear example, is Italy with 190 billion euros, which is almost more than a double of Spain, which is the second country listed here. This second introductory graph dives a bit more into the analysis, showing the level of green quota spending and also digital quota spending in blue. That the plans have identified, and differently from the previous chart, here the pioneer countries, so the one that presented the hydrogen strategy, are more scattered unevenly on the graph, and they are not among, as you can see, the highest in terms of green quota spending. Now, digging a bit more into the details, we arrive at some interesting results. Here, the graph show shows some interesting results that basically, leaving aside Germany with 24% holds the highest percentage of hydrogen spending on green tag spending. The remaining part of the set is under 13%. Not to mention that half of the sample has zero direct hydrogen expenditure. This means that expenditure in support of hydrogen, at least as regards the resilience plans approved so far, represents on a weighted average 7% of the value of the total green expenditure of all the countries. That is quite a little, considering that the Hydrogen Council roadmap predicts an 18% penetration in final energy demand by 2050. In absolute terms, we can say that Spain is the country that has allocated the highest amount of euro 3.6 billion, while France and Germany approximately 2.5 billion, and Italy is placed fourth with 2 billion approximately. If first we have dealt with the financial side in these last slides, I want to introduce also the commitment shown by the countries in terms of proposed targets. The categories here displayed are the one used in the hydrogen strategies presented by Filippo Del Grosso, and reflect the sector of application of the hydrogen projects of the staff working documents. The high presence of the sectorial macro category, which is here plotted in red, reflect the relevance of the projects relative to the whole hydrogen value chain, and not to a specific segment of the economy. So there is the tendency to broaden the spectrum of action and not focus on a single sector, which is definitely in contrast with the results found in the strategies analysis. On the other hand, this graph shows totally different results for the level of commitment displayed by the countries that presented the hydrogen strategy with the one just seen in the last slide. In this situation, as far as the targets are concerned, the pioneer countries are also the most active. At a time level, this slide and the next graph help us to understand the will of the member states when it comes to hydrogen. The year of the projects, the other projects advance or postponing the larger targets here means that the year of the projects listed here are showing that countries would like to postpone the target here. That means that there is so that there is more time for completing the target project, since 2026 is the last year available for the recovery and resilience facility to complete all the projects presented in the staff working documents. And the orange distribution has been derived from the target years of the green tagged projects presented by France, Spain, Italy, and Germany, and has been used as a benchmark to compare the hydrogen target years identified in all the other recovery and resilience plans, which is the blue distribution listed here, the hydrogen project divided by year. As you can see, the differences are straightforward and quite visible. So with respect to the first pillar of the recovery and resilience plans, countries tend to postpone, as I said, the commitment in hydrogen deployment. And this situation is made even more evident if we look at the simple statistics in the tab below, where the asymmetry index perfectly show the situation. Okay, moving instead on the comparison between countries that have published a strategy and countries that have not, referring to the hydrogen targets only, we can say that for pioneer countries, it is easier to take short and medium-term approaches, as you can see from the green distribution. While for the rest of the European countries, the barriers are still high and are more willing to postpone this kind of tasks. The blue distribution is considerably shifted toward 2026, which is, as I said, the last year available. These differences can surely come from a greater knowledge of the topic from the side of the pioneer countries, since they have already presented an hydrogen strategy, and perhaps also from a higher level of interest in the topic, which is can be corroborated by the fact that they can actually implement part of the hydrogen strategy that they presented earlier in the last years. Now that finally monetary opportunity arise from the recovery and resilience facility. Now the conclusions. So all in all, we can count 12 billion euros available for hydrogen in recovery plans, which is a considerable amount, while the overall green spending is much more. It is around 180 billion euros. So hydrogen can play a role, but definitely a minor role, and it is quite clear that no country is prioritizing hydrogen. The analysis also shows that some countries are better positioned than others. In particular, the countries that have already published an hydrogen strategies seem to provide a better enable environment for these kind of investments. In terms of sectors, we see that transportation is, of course, well represented, but many countries are developing sectorial targets that often translate in the so-called hydrogen valleys that covers the whole value chain. Eventually, when talking about hydrogen production, recovery plans confirm that green hydrogen is the most adopted solution. Okay, thank you for the attention. Now I can leave the floor to Ilaria Livi, my colleague that will lead the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. There are some questions from the audience. The first question is, why do you think most of the strategies do not mention the option of blue hydrogen?
I can take this one, I believe. So essentially, what we found is that first, there are some technical constraints, there are some technical issues, because first, for blue hydrogen, you need the infrastructure. The infrastructure is not always in place, and not in every country. And we also saw that from a technical standpoint, carbon capture, use and storage is not completely mature. There are several ways to do CCUS with several degrees of CO2 recovery and several degrees of costs involved, which means that there is no clarity from a technology standpoint, and the perception of blue hydrogen as being as the key enabler is somehow not completely agreed upon. In a sense, we might say that there are two different lobbies at European level. One is actually pushing for green hydrogen solutions. then we have some, let's say, legacy lobbies that are maybe connected to the oil and gas sector, given that there are relevant investments that have already been done, given that there is the possibility to exploit existing synergy between the gas, the heat network, and to fill those networks potentially with a blending of hydrogen. There are also, let's say, companies that are actually supporting the intermediate way. The way blue hydrogen was not completely tackled is probably also more derived by the fact that the aim is in the long run. Given that there is no focus in the mid-term in the strategies, in the long run, when we consider 2050, we take, for instance, euros. So we have the overall objective of achieving net zero emissions. In that case, most likely green hydrogen would be the ideal solution. The fact, and this is the missing link in hydrogen strategies, is that we do not know how to get there. And the problem when you just face the long term, but you don't get, you don't understand how to get to achieve your objective, how to get there. You do not simply mention the blue hydrogen, which might be actually a suitable option. And those are my two cents on the topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Filippo. There is another question. It is, could you please be more specific about what are the projects that are included in the recovery plans?
Okay, I can take that. So it is difficult actually to be more specific since the recovery plans are very generic, and at this stage it is very difficult to describe specific projects presented in the recovery plans. Actually, in the recovery plans there are projects, very broad description of projects related to different sectors of the value chain, transport, for example, production, other types of uses, but not specific projects such as, for example, the IPCEI projects presented by the ENSO-G platform. This is quite an interesting topic since as a group we are developing a project, and it will be published a project that deal with the IPCE projects, and it is still at an early stage because there are not specific lists for all the countries, and neither at the European level, but we are working on that and also considering to publish some results.
Thank you, Eduardo. There is another question. It is stated that green hydrogen needs a lot of dedicated additional VRE. So it is really interesting to check if hydrogen development national plans include this additional VRE capacity or not. So do you think that these national plans will include additional VRE capacity or not?
VIR, could you, I pretty much don't get the acronym. VI?
VRE.
Ah, variable renewable energies. Ah, yeah, sure. Sorry, okay, sorry. And the question was related to
green hydrogen in the national development plans, if this additional variable renewable energy capacity will be included or not.
Most likely they will. Of course, it is very difficult to do generation planning in the long run, which means that when you do the capacity planning in the long run, you take into consideration several aspects. Okay, the fact is that what we risk with renewables is that we might have an oversized capacity, and that what is not yet contemplated, at least at the level of strategies, is how to cope with all the grid requirements in terms of stability, in terms of frequency regulation. That is pretty much missing, and this is why it is also important to roll out the electrolyzer technology, because electrolysis can potentially provide grid services, which will be not only useful, but also potentially remunerated. And it is yet to be assessed how these grid services provided by electrolyzer will be remunerated. They might be included in the tariff, they might be market-based, they might find a hybrid solution for them. So as a rule of thumb, when a green hydrogen strategy states, okay, we will deploy green hydrogen solution because we will further expand our renewable generation capacity, what we saw, at least, is that there are no clear indications and there are no clear commitments. This is true not only for hydrogen, but this is generally true for the entire energy transition and decarbonization process. We are planning to have an ever-increasing installed capacity of renewables, but how to manage this increased capacity, that's a problem. And then there will be some other solutions, such as capacity payments, capacity mechanism, distributed generation services. There will be further improvements in terms of the ancillary markets. All these must be tackled. They might be included in the analysis. And this is what we were referring to when we said we miss the holistic approach. We are targeting just the final goal, which is very good, very positive to us, but the way to get there, which is, for instance, blue hydrogen, and how to harmonize those results within the overall energy system, this is yet up to debate. I hope I answered.
Yes, so thank you very much also, Filippo and Edoardo, for the answers that you provided in this Q&A session. I think that we can simply add also to the final question about more projects concerning hydrogen and renewables, that so far, at least from the projects that we have seen that should be included in the project of common interest for hydrogen and for the projects that were presented from Italian companies. At present, electrolyzers are always associated with a dedicated renewable power plants, so it is unlikely that at the beginning there will be electrolyzers that will operate by using excess grid power or excess renewable energies, but they will. So the idea of the projects that we've seen so far is having an associated generation that will, and the electrolyzer will be basically a captive demand for that generation. And therefore it is even more true what Filippo was saying. So we have reached the end of our first webinar. I thank you all again for the for your presence, and I hope that we were able to meet your expectations, and I invite you again to download from next week our research report and more in general to follow our activities and to keep in touch for any suggestion or any possible collaboration. And I thank you very much. Thank you again.